Microeconomic reform is really about trying to find ways of increasing productivity, find ways of so we can do more with what we've currently got, better ways of working, smarter ways of working if you like, rather than necessarily working harder. And what we've done in this report is look at a range of issues that we think will increase the productivity of the economy. The end result can be higher individual living standards, but it can also mean higher society assets, such as better schools, better hospitals, better sporting facilities, better cultural facilities. There's two particular issues in WA at the moment that make it even more important. One is the government does have some particular challenges. It's got a growing population and therefore growing demand for services and infrastructure, but it's got quite soft revenues, got quite high debt, and it's got significant constraints. Therefore, there's a challenge for the government to find ways of making its limited resources spread as far as it can, and that's what micro-reform is about. The second reason is the economy's come through a strong growth, driven largely by the resources sector as a result of growing demands in China. That demand is slowing down, and indeed we've seen unemployment start to creep up again. This is a fairly major report. It's some 350 pages long and contains something like 31 recommendations that we think would improve Western Australians' living standards. We sort of divided those 31 recommendations into three areas. One area dealing with infrastructure, another area dealing with incentives, and a third area dealing with barriers to entry. In the infrastructure area, some of the key issues are we're keen to make sure that the government makes wise decisions about infrastructure. We've got very wide-ranging challenges. We've got limited resources. So how do we make sure that the government makes decisions on infrastructure that delivers those projects that are going to give us the most net benefits? We also need to look at making sure we're using our existing infrastructure as well as we can. Can we make those existing assets work harder so that we don't have to spend more money on them and we can spend money elsewhere? And we look at things like congestion charges, time of use tariffs for electricity and so on. The second area we look at is incentives, and this largely comes down to both regulation or red tape and state taxation. There's no question that regulation is necessary. What is unnecessary is regulation that has a net cost or doesn't actually do what it was intended to do. And we've got a number of recommendations in the report which says we should be reviewing existing regulation and equally, but perhaps even slightly more importantly, what processes can we put in place to make sure that we don't put in place inappropriate regulation in the future? And there are a range of recommendations about tightening that process within government. We also look at state taxation. Here the issue is an efficient tax is one which doesn't have perverse incentives in it. It's not inefficient, it doesn't cause people to do things they would otherwise not do. And one of the things we've looked at here is it's generally accepted that, for example, that land tax is a more efficient tax than perhaps payroll tax and certainly than transfer duties. And what we suggested here is some options for how we can put a greater reliance on more efficient taxes and actually, in one option, remove the most inefficient tax, which we think is transfer duties on residential property. The third general area we looked at is barriers to entry. A lot of these issues were picked up in the national competition reforms subsequent to the early 1990s, but there's still some unfinished business. So we still have some areas where government is making decisions about when consumers can do things rather than consumers doing it. And the general argument is that a competitive market with consumers making those decisions is more likely to deliver what society wants. So we've still got government restrictions in areas like taxis, in areas like the Potato Marketing Corporation, in areas like retail trading hours, and we've got a government intervention in areas like the domestic gas reservation policy. This report makes recommendations that those government regulations in those areas that are creating barriers to competition or barriers to entry or are limiting competition should be removed. The driver for those industries should be consumers, not government regulation. If all of these 31 recommendations in this report were implemented, we would see significant benefits for Western Australia and for Western Australians. We would see government with greater capacity to respond to those growing demands being made by a growing population. We would see individual consumers better off with more choice and lower prices. Imagine, for example, that you could get a taxi any time of the day or night without having to wait in queues. Imagine that rather than planning your weekend around when shops are open, imagine you can plan your weekend around your social purposes and know that shops will be open whenever you want to go there. Imagine being able to drive into the city in a relatively uncongested way. These are just some of the benefits that we think will come from these reforms. At the end of the day, it is about increasing productivity, and that means getting more for the limited resources we've got. And at the end of the day, what that's about is increasing the living standards, be they their personal standards or broader societal benefits for all Western Australians. The next step in our public consultation process. When we were first given this reference from the State Treasurer, we issued an issues paper and asked for public comment on that. We then issued a discussion paper and again asked for public comment and got significant feedback from a wide cross-section of the community, for which we're very appreciative. We've now today released the draft report and we're now going out for another round of public consultation, and we would really appreciate critical but constructive comment, particularly if it's got some substantiated evidence backing the sort of submissions that we might get up. Having received those submissions and have done a little more research ourselves, we will then be presenting the government with our final report by June 30th this year.